Hello, my friends, and welcome to this another Johnny Vedmore Read Through with me, your host, Johnny Vedmore, and we are going to go through time again, as we always do. We're going quite far back in time, 150 years, and we're going to the birth of vaccines and this complicated subject that is so heavily censored. And many people know who Jeremy Farrar is. He's now one of the heads of the World Health Organization. He was the head of the Wellcome Trust for some time. He came up in one of my articles, the Wellcome Five, which you can watch another Johnny Vedmore read through on. That's quite a long article. It's about 15,000 words, and it goes through one of the most powerful men during the COVID era. Whitty and Fauci delegated all of the responsibility for planning COVID over to Jeremy Farrar. So he was obviously quite a big fish in quite a very or a very small pond. And so it's very interesting to study him. And when I studied him, I went back, like I do with most people, I went back through his family history. And something became very clear to me, a mystery. They came across a mystery, another mystery. I keep coming across mysteries. Some people call people like me who come across mysteries conspiracy theorists because we see something that is off, something that doesn't make sense. So, for instance, you go back to 1917 to the birth of Jeremy Farrar's father, Eric Farrar, and you discover that that he's got a fair few siblings, and there's an 11-year gap between him and his last sibling. That made me interesting. That made me interested. I was like, that's a long time. Normally people have their kids quite like few years apart here and there. You know, they keep coming in a steady stream until they don't come anymore, especially back then, until they don't come anymore. And it was the fact that the parents of Eric Farrar were meant to be 52 years old, the mother and father. And I didn't, something smelt fishy about that. It's very rare you go back to the early 1900s and couples are having babies when they're 52. It's not unheard of. It's just super rare. So if you come across it in an article, you go, wait a minute, something doesn't make sense here. And then you do a little bit more investigating. You go, ooh, there's a lot that didn't make sense here. And there seems to be a conspiracy at foot. Yes, I've gone through the history of Jeremy Farrar and I came back and I came across something quite peculiar. Another guy who lived back in that time who was identical in almost every way to Jeremy Farrar. He did the same sort of job. He spent a lot of time in the Far East. He went through the same sort of institutions in the UK when being trained. He was a vaccinator. He was head of his game eventually. He was the ones the British would send out to check out a plague in Manchuria. But most interestingly of all, his name was Reginald Farrar, and he was supposedly not connected familiarly with Jeremy Farrar. And I started to smell something fishy going on, and I investigated and found an extraordinary story, a story that I will tell you today. It's a tale of two Farrars. Now, there is going to be a second part to this. And that second part is going to go into kings and queens, etc. And we'll get into that eventually, but not today. Today, we're going to go simply to newspaste.com. Look, here we are in newspaste.com. And here we go. A Tale of Two Farrars. Yes, this is the title for A Tale of Two Farrars. There's Jeremy Farrar over there, Reginald Farrar, and they're getting closer to you. A Tale of Two Farrars, A Legacy of Disease, by me, Johnny Vedmore, for Newspaste. In early 2020, shortly after Jeremy Farrar orchestrated the creation of the Proximal Origins of Sars-Cov2 paper, I began to investigate Farrar's significant influence on global vaccine policy. However, My hunt for the truth eventually led me back to the turn of the 20th century and to a man with almost exactly the same influence in exactly the same arena. His name was also Farrar. This is the story of Reginald Anstruther Farrar. Here we go. Reginald Anstruther Farrar was born on the 14th of May, 1861. Let me put on my glasses and start that again. Oh, yeah. Reginald Anstruther Farrar was born on the 14th of May, 1861, in Harrow, Middlesex, England. He was born to the Archdeacon of Westminster, Frederick William Farrar, and his wife Lucy Mary Farrar née Cardew, and was their eldest child. As Reginald's father was Archdeacon of Westminster, the family lived a privileged life from the get-go. However, he was also an extremely talented, fastidious, and astute young man, soon passing his matriculation examination for entry into Oxford University's Keble College. Farrar's eventual obituary describes the crossroads the young man reached during this period of his life. It was originally intended that he should take holy orders, but though always a religious man and actuated by the purest principles, he felt that he could not subscribe to the 39 articles of the established church. He therefore turned his attention to medicine and became a medical student at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Before heading off to university proper, Reginald Anstruther Farrar had been studying at Marlborough College, a public school which had been founded in 1843, specifically to school sons of the Church of England clergymen. On the 19th of October 1880, at the age of 19, Farrar officially became an undergraduate at Oxford University's Keble College, which had itself only been founded 10 years prior to stress the Catholic nature of the Church of England. In 1883, Farrar gained his Bachelor of Arts degree at Oxford and continued to earn a Master of Arts and Bachelor of Medicine's degree in 1889 and his Doctor of Mediation qualification the following year. As mentioned, Reginald Farrar trained as a physician at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, a well-renowned teaching hospital. At St. Bartholomew's, Farrar was described as a flamboyant and likable character. His loosely tied and flowing red cravat, strident voice, unconventional manner, enthusiasm, impulsiveness, and happy disposition made him a well-known student at the hospital. He left St. Bartholomew's in 1887. By 1890, he had passed his exams to gain membership to the Royal College of Surgeons, making Reginald Farrar a fully qualified and highly skilled medical professional. In 1888, Reginald A. Farrar married the fourth daughter of Canon Mapleton, who had previously been the vicar of Meanwood near Leeds, but by this time had become the rector of Stamford. On the 20th of October 1888, the Yorkshire Herald newspaper reported that Reginald Farrar's father, referred to as the Venerable Archdeacon Farrar, was also Canon of Westminster and one of the 10 chaplain in ordinary to Queen Victoria. The wedding of Reginald and Mary took place at Goodrich Parish Church near Hereford on a Thursday afternoon, with the ceremony being performed by the Lord Bishop of Hereford with the assistance of Reginald's father, Archdeacon Farrar. Mary Mapleton wore a dress of ivory white satin marvelou as she was given away by her father. Eric Farrar, Reginald's brother, was reported as the best man for the marriage of Mary and Reginald. In 1890, Reginald Farrar was listed as having a practice located at 60 St. Martin's, Stamford. On 9th of March 1891, Farrar officially became a Freemason, passing the nomination stage on the 21st of April the same year and being raised on the 19th of May 1891, as recorded in the United Grand Lodge of England Freemason Membership Register. The 1892 edition of Kelly's Directory, a publication which listed the business addresses of qualified medical practitioners, noted Farrar as working from St. Peter's Vale in Lincolnshire. In 1893, Farrar took his MD and served in the position of house surgeon to Sir William Savary prior to the latter man's knighthood. Then, in 1893, a tragedy occurred. Reginald Farrar's brother-in-law and patient, Mr. David Hubert Mapleton, was found dead. Mapleton had seemed in good spirits, according to another of his brother-in-laws, Reginald Horace Ainsley Powys, who was staying at Shillingthorpe Hall at the time of Mapleton's death. At 11 a.m. on Friday, 28th of April, 1893, Mapleton spoke briefly with Powys in the study. Powys noted that Mapleton was in usual health and seemed very cheerful, as was reported in the Leeds Mercury 5 days later. The deceased, Mapleton, did not return to luncheon, and witness, Powys, went in search of him. He was told that Mr. Mapleton had gone fishing, so he proceeded to the river adjoining the hall ground, and near a favourite fishing place he saw a lint on the water. He discerned a dark object in the river, and found it to be the body of Mr. Mapleton. He tried to restore animation, but unsuccessfully. Near the body was a fishing rod. On the previous day, Mr. Mapleton had seemed particularly cheerful. Dr. Reginald Farrar of Stamford, another brother-in-law, said that he had attended the deceased professionally for 3 years. His general health was fair, but he suffered sometimes from attacks of vertigo, occasionally rather severely. At times, the attacks were so acute as to render him insensible. The coroner, who was assigned to the case, came to the obvious conclusion from the evidence that the deceased evidently fell into the river, and came to the verdict of accidentally drowned. In 1894, Reginald A. Farrar began to publish articles over the preceding decades, authored and edited medical literature. One of his first articles, which publicly bore his name, was written for the British Medical Journal and published on the 13th of October 1894 under the title Death Following Vaccination. In the short article, Farrar refers to himself as a public vaccinator, which at the time was a relatively new official role. During this period, smallpox outbreaks saw compulsory vaccination processes implemented, yet the tools used to vaccinate people were limited, experimental, and sometimes dangerous. The British Medical Journal article written by Farrar discusses a case where he vaccinated a 5-month-old who died as a result of the process. Farrar paints a very distinct and definable process for vaccinating children. He stated, "This child was brought to me on October 10th, 1893, for vaccination. She struck me as being rather small and thin for her age, 5 months, but otherwise had nothing obviously amiss. I did not, therefore, at the time see sufficient cause to postpone the vaccination, though in view of the poor development of the child, I should have done so had the mother desired it. I vaccinated in 4 places using a carefully cleaned lancet and Dr. Renner's calf lymph. Other children vaccinated at the same time and from the same supplier lymph did perfectly well in all respects." This was a rudimentary stage within the evolution of vaccination processes, and the procedure involved infecting healthy patients with a malady, a taboo principle for disciples of Hippocrates. However, the death that Farrar was reporting had resulted from the vaccination process administered by Farrar himself. He goes on to write, "Instead, however, of the scabs drying up and separating in usual times, they persisted unduly, and from the intermixture of clotted blood presented a limpet shell aspect resembling rupial scabs. When at last they separated, the ulceration was found to have penetrated the whole skin, exposing the muscle beneath and leaving holes which looked as though they had been punched out. There was no oedema of the arm, and the skin round the vesicles appeared perfectly healthy throughout. The child dwindled peaked and pined and finally died from no very obvious cause on November 29th, 1893, 6 months old, 7 weeks after the vaccination, and about a week after the separation of the scabs. Farrar put the child's death down to constitutional malaise induced by vaccinia in a poorly nourished child. Like many vaccinators of the era, Farrar was very careful not to rile up the very strong and public opposition who were battling against compulsory vaccinations or even the idea of vaccinations en general. The same year in which Farrar wrote Death Following Vaccination, the Tamworth Herald produced articles such as The Opposition to Vaccination, which reported on examples of widespread public disapprobation of what was becoming a commonplace and sometimes compulsory medical intervention. The aforementioned article states, in Mile End, London, says a London correspondent, there are 8,000 unvaccinated children. The guardians, armed by the law with power to judge whether an excuse for non-vaccination is reasonable or not, they naturally decide, in accordance with their antipathy to Jenner's system, that any objection is reasonable. Supported by the great congregation who meet at Mr. Charrington's large assembly hall, they look with confidence to the next election, resolved to carry their opposition to vaccination still further. While some of the objectors were opposed to vaccination process in general, many more were mobilized by the compulsory aspect of the relatively intrusive medical procedure. This same period also saw political controversy surrounding the late release of what was referred to as the Vaccination Report. The paper in question was a special report of the Vaccination Commission on Cumulative Penalties, which was due to be released and contained information and statistics concerning the mass vaccination programs in England and Wales. The penalties for refusing vaccination had become a hot-button issue, and the aforementioned paper made clear that these sort of penalties should be abolished. As a Leicester Mercury article from the period put it, defaulters under the Vaccination Acts should be treated more respectfully than pickpockets. Local government boards had been resisting calls by anti-vaccinators for the information to be made public, which led to Arthur Balfour, who was then leader of the Conservative Party, and Herbert Henry Asquith, who was serving as the Home Office, to calm the situation. The authorities had been shaken by the organizational prowess of those opposing compulsory vaccinations of all children, as described in the Bristol Mercury on the 20th of May, 1893. The medical profession are not likely to set up a political league to rival the organization of the anti-vaccination faddists. They can only advise protection against smallpox and marvel at the infatuation of those who neglect it. But their resentment of the runaway policy of government on Friday will be none the less serious because it does not express itself by public meetings, by hearty demonstrations, and by letter-writing rings, which ministers just now appear over-willing to accept as public opinion. It was clear that the establishment needed systematic reorganization if it wanted to sway or control what it would accept as public opinion. From 1894, Farrar's written work became more regular. Also in 1894, he published Sciatica associated with iliac abscess and caries of lumbar vertebrae. The following year, he contributed to a piece entitled On the Clinical and Pathological Relations of General Paralysis of the Insane, and in 1897 he produced Case of Numerous Hydrated Cysts Disseminated in the Abdominal and Pelvic Cavities. But it was during the dying embers of the 1800s and the turn of the new century where Farrar began writing his most important works. On the 17th of December 1894, Mary Farrar gave birth to her son, with the news announced publicly in the Daily Telegraph 4 days later. In 1895, we also discover that Farrar was active in local politics. A Lincolnshire Echo article notes him as a Conservative Party candidate for St Mary's Ward during the municipal by-elections at Stamford. A pox on both your houses. In 1898, Reginald Anstruther Farrar left England for Bombay after accepting an appointment under the Indian government to take up plague duty. At 38 years old, Farrar was relatively young for such a position and was reportedly giving up a lucrative practice in Stamford. This move to India in order to study severe outbreak of bubonic plague signified a vital turning point in the life of Reginald Farrar. In 1901 census, Farrar is noted as a 39-year-old doctor of medicine from Harrow with a practice running out of 30 Ashley Place in London. In 1902, the paper on the nature of plague infection written by Farrar was read at the British Medical Association's annual conference. Farrar had made some extremely vital observations about how the plague spread. The Savannah Morning News reported on some of his findings, stating, "Before every outbreak among human beings in India, immense number of dead rats were found lying about. Whenever dead rats were found in the servants' quarters of some particular house, plague-stricken patients from that house duly appeared within a few days at the hospital. Dr. Farrar found that plague did not spread along lines of human intercourse, like smallpox, for example, but was propagated by some sort of soil infection, always accompanied by the appearance of innumerable dead rats." In March 1903, it was announced that Reginald Farrar had been appointed as medical inspector under the local government board by its president, succeeding Mr. Arnold Royal, who retired. On the 22nd of March that same year, Reginald Farrar's father, Reverend F.W. Farrar, who was then Dean of Canterbury, passed away. The following year, Thomas Y. Crowell and Company in New York published The Life of Frederick William Farrar, sometime Dean of Canterbury, by Dr. Reginald Farrar. The book, which contains 16 illustrations, a bibliography, and an index, had been collaborative work with Farrar being assisted by various friends and colleagues of the late Dean Farrar. In England, James Nesbitt and Company published Reginald Farrar's very public ode to his beloved father. In 1903, Farrar also produced Aids to Sanitary Science for the use of candidates for public health qualifications, a training manual which is now available through the Wellcome Library. On the 30th of December 1904, the Tunbridge Wells Courier printed an article entitled "The Farrar Memorial at Canterbury," which covered the unveiling of a new west window of the chapter house of Canterbury Cathedral, dedicated to the late Dean Farrar, an event which was, of course, attended by Dr. Reginald Farrar. By 1905, Farrar was becoming one of the United Kingdom's leading experts on the spread of most diseases. In May of that year, an outbreak of spotted fever began to cause panic in a small town in Northamptonshire called Hertfordshire. Dr. Reginald Farrar was sent in to investigate and claimed to have found a distinctive microorganism. In a Manchester Courier article entitled "Spotted Fever," it states, "The cause of the outbreak was mysterious, and the sanitary conditions would not account for it. The only light that could be thrown on the matter was that Mr. Chambers, father of some of the victims, had received a paper from America where the disease was raging." In March of the same year, Reginald Farrar again played a central role in the investigation of an outbreak of disease. Shining a light on poor rural sanitation had become an important part of Farrar's work as medical officer for the local government board. In Clun, Shropshire, and Sleaford, Lincolnshire, grossly insanitary conditions were put under Farrar's proverbial microscope, and on the 15th of March 1905, Dr. Reginald Farrar began his inspection of Clun and Sleaford's infamously unsanitary living conditions. In July 1906, Farrar was busy writing a report on how to clean up water supplies to various villages in North Wales. In the same year, he also wrote reports on sanitary administration in Durham, as well as one on dirty dairies in Anglesey, all those dirty dairies. In February 1907, Farrar was recorded investigating the sanitary circumstances in the district of Gunthwaite and Ingbirchworth Parish Council on behalf of the local government board. A few months later, in an article entitled Hop Picking Evils, Dr. Farrar on conditions in Worcestershire, it was reported that Reginald Farrar was investigating the lodgings and accommodation of hop pickers and pickers of fruit and vegetables who worked in the country. The Daily Telegraph reported on Farrar's findings, stating, "That hop pickers," observed Farrar, "are not a class gravely dissatisfied with the provision made for them may be inferred from the fact that it is generally the custom for them to resort year after year to the same farm, retaining even a lien on the same hut. On one farm I heard of an old woman who died this year, but had previously picked there for 45 years. The report written by Farrar on the hop pickers was later referred to by David Lloyd George during questions in the House of Commons. Although the hop pickers were often forced to live in cramped and unsanitary conditions, their plight was nothing compared to that of the navvies who Farrar was investigating during the same year. When reporting on living conditions of workers within Farrar's local health board report, the Guardian journalist wrote, "There were not even any shelters to which they could resort in wet weather, and for the considerable time they had to beg their drinking water from farmers and cottagers, or drink that which was pumped up from neighbouring river for engine use. Some of the workmen built rough shelters and fir bows and corrugated iron, and nicknamed them respectively Firwood Avenue and Hotel Cecil. Cramped accommodation for workers during this period was commonplace around the United Kingdom. Farrar's work inspecting such matters continued for the next few years, with him appearing in a later newspaper report entitled Four Men in a Hen Coop. His investigations eventually led to a report which was published by Wymans and Sons on the 15th of September 1909 with the catchy title Report by Dr. Reginald Farrar to Local Government Board on Lodging of Workmen Employed in Construction of Public Works, and was sold for 3 pennies. Farrar's main task wasn't inspecting living conditions of workers to assure compliance with regulation. In reality, Farrar was looking for disease. In February 1908, the Holyhead Anglesey Mail reported on orders given by Farrar and others to isolate any patients who arrived in port who may be suffering from the plague of cholera. In 1908, Post Office Home Counties directories listed Reginald Farrar as practicing from 7 Grove Park Gardens in the affluent Chiswick area of London. Although it would be noted that in another medical directory from 3 years prior stating that Farrar's practice had been running from 1 Grove Park Gardens. So they might be wrong. 1 and 7 might have been mixed up, or he swapped surgeries. At the end of 1908, Farrar was warning of the dangers of tuberculosis milk and flesh after inspecting farmsteads where he discovered the fold yards ill-drained and filthy, with cow sheds dark, dirty, ill-ventilated, and generally of insufficient capacity for the number of cattle they contained. In 1909, Farrar was reporting on technical, though not illegal, overcrowding in Oldham. while also making a positive note on home proud women of the town as being a credit to the region. In that year, he was tasked with reporting on living conditions of pea pickers, the general living conditions of various navvies working nationwide, and he even wrote a report on the evils of subbing, the process of workers being continuously advanced wages, leading them to them accruing significant debt. On the 30th of August 1910, Farrar was tasked with visiting Melton Mowbray to investigate an outbreak of spotted fever. The Melton district reported 14 cases of the illness the previous week, which led to Farrar's impromptu visit. However, by the following week, the outbreak was being reported as having rapidly subsided, with risk of infection being slight. A Farrar off place. By 1911, Dr. Reginald Farrar had become an esteemed member of a very elite group of British infectious disease experts. He was nominated to represent Great Britain on the International Plague Commission, which was set up to investigate an outbreak of pneumonic plague in China. Even though the plague in China was relatively under control by the time Farrar began to pack for the expedition, newspapers were reporting that he was being sent to help the Chinese to deal with the scourge. A message via the Reuters newswire from Peking during this time reported that about 7,000 people had already died during the outbreak. Farrar's involvement in the International Play Commission was being reported from Washington to Sydney. His basic biography was also reported in the Guardian Journal. A week later, Farrar was being praised in articles with titles such as Heroic British Doctor Going to China to Investigate the Plague and Guarding Against the Plague. The news of pneumonic plague outbreak, which was ravaging Manchuria, saw a mild panic ensue in Western Europe. Even though the Brooklyn Daily Eagle were titling reports such as plague cases in England were detected on ships arriving from Manchuria, this sort of bombastic reporting was soon dialed down a notch, with Farrar stating publicly there was little danger of plague spreading to Western Europe, let alone Britain. Farrar's involvement in the Manchurian outbreak led to him writing a report on his findings, which gives us incredible insight into the evolution of pandemic responses. Initially, the Chinese had requested that Britain send Sir W.J. Simpson, to attend their first ever international medical symposium, who had gained international fame for his work on plague in South Africa and Hong Kong. But this request was denied by the British, and they instead sent Reginald Farrar. In the winter of early 1911, while Reginald Farrar studied the largest outbreak the Manchurians had seen for a long time, he made observations that would be fundamental for the British establishment's understanding of how populations respond to pandemics, and the conclusions of his following paper were astounding. Farrar didn't only investigate the outbreak and the procedures enacted to curb the spread of plague, he was also in China to study the reaction of local population to the spread of the disease. Farrar was quick to note the potential benefits which the psychological effect of pandemic presented to changing wider social patterns of behavior. In May 1912, in the epidemiological section of the Royal Society of Medicine Journal, Farrar published his findings in a paper ominously titled Plague in Manchuria. Farrar begins the paper by writing, that's too far. During the winter of 1910-1911, Manchuria was ravaged by an outbreak of pneumonic plague, which recalls some of the historic outbreaks of the Middle Ages, but to which modern time afford no parallel. When compared to the mortality caused by bubonic plague in India, the actual proportions of the Manchuria epidemic do not seem large, but it captured the popular imagination by reasons of the dramatic features which attended it, its mysterious origins, rapid spread, and appalling virulence. Farrar had previously been studying the bubonic plague, which had ravaged parts of India throughout the decade before. Millions had died in scenes that brought back medieval memory of chaos and death to any European, especially in colonial Britain. Like during the worst years of plague-ridden British history, the Indian Black Death was of the bubonic variety and was thought to spread from human to human via infected fleas. Farrar reported the Manchurian sickness was solely pneumonic virus, spreading from human to human mainly through the coughing of sputum into the localized environment. Although this was mostly true, the Manchurian plague took three forms. This period may have been relatively early in medical history, yet the scientists of Britain, Japan, China, and Russia were all working on reproducing this virus in animals, regardless of any potential dangers. The advances in technology meant they weren't only capable of isolating and identifying the specific strains of the virus, but they were also capable of reproducing the virulent plague cultures under very basic laboratory conditions. As soon as advances in technology allowed, scientists began doing a range of basic observational experiments. One Chinese colleague of Farrar had made their infected patients cough their sputum onto a new guinea pig every day for 3 weeks, only to note that every guinea pig died. Rats were injected with pneumonic plague to see what would happen, and a free-for-all began on the scientific testing of the offending Tarabagan marmots, which had been the source of the Manchurian outbreak. Reginald Farrar's paper, although over 100 years old, is more relevant now than ever before for many reasons. In fact, one of the main purposes for Dr. Reginald Farrar being sent to this remote deathscape was to examine the use of very early experimental vaccination process. When referring to the medical interventions being tested during Manchurian epidemic, Farrar's notes give us a glimpse into the technology of the time. With regard to inoculation, Haffkine's prophylactic was tried a good deal. Dr. Martin inoculated him before he went out, and Dr. Petrie gave him another dose in the train. There was quite a long discussion on that point at the conference. Galliotti was holding out for his serum, Martini for killed agar cultures, and Haffkine for Haffkine's prophylactic. Many patients who had been inoculated subsequently contracted plague and died. Marmentov had been injected 3 times, Dr. Jackson, he believes, twice. 32 patients inoculated by Haffkine at Harbin contracted the plague and died. There seemed to be some evidence that those inoculated were somewhat less liable to take the disease, but he did not think Haffkine's injection was much of a success. If one had been recently inoculated and in the negative phase, one might, some thought, be even more liable to plague than without such inoculation. Farrar also mentions the US appointment to the Chinese symposium, Dr. Strong testing out the potential of new vaccine technology, reporting, Dr. Strong fought hard for the use of attenuated living cultures. Dr. Strong had exceptionally good facilities for testing these methods. He was a government surgeon in Manila, and his vaccine was a living culture attenuated with alcohol. After preliminary experiments on guinea pigs, he satisfied himself as the result of an inoculation of 200 criminals who had been sentenced to death that the attenuated living culture was harmless as ordinary vaccine for variola. 64 of these criminals were afterwards inoculated with virulent plague culture and only 16 died. They voluntarily submitted to the experiment as an alternative to execution. Though the method was not sufficiently appreciated by the conference, he thought it held out great promise, and if he were going to face plague again, he would have the attenuated living cultures inoculated. This was the birth of vaccine technology, and there were no limits. There you go. That's a picture of Reginald Farrar. A picture of Reginald Anstruther Farrar featured in the Buffalo News newspaper on the 12th of March, 1911. Farrar's Manchuria paper had shown the British epidemiological establishment something they couldn't quite comprehend. They had failed at containing the spread of bubonic plague in India, even while they were in control of all the administrative levers of power. Yet these Chinamen, as the paper refers to them on occasion, were capable of achieving a significantly lower casualty rate, even without a state-of-the-art sanitary authority in place. Dr. Butler stated his skepticism that the Manchurian authorities had been responsible for controlling the spread of the virus, which is noted in the discussion section of the paper, saying that, of course, there was a point in favor of such administration, that they were dealing with a disease which immobilized almost all who attacked. There were very rapid effects and universal death. That undoubtedly made the problem much easier than it would be where there were mild cases which went about and diffused the disease among them others. Still, it was difficult to believe that administrative measures could have achieved what had been depicted. But Farrar soon pointed out during the discussion phase of this report that it was a matter of self-preservation which eventually controlled the infection. Isolation of the infected was not only practiced on a case-by-case basis, but when neighboring towns and regions became aware of this deadly virus running amok in other areas, they immediately closed off train lines and roads without needing to be ordered to do so. Responding directly to Dr. Butler's skepticism, Farrar said, with regard to Dr. Butler's remarks, he thought the members present had scarcely appreciated the fact that he said the crude efforts of the people had done much to protect the people from the plague. A person with plague was so ill, and all others had such a fright lest they should take it, that there was very little contact. People would not go near a house where plague was, and when folks were roused, isolation thus effected was as effective as orthodox sanitary measures. In Fujian, there was a very effective organization. The town was split into 4 divisions, and no person was allowed to go from one part of the town to another unless he or she had a pass. The divisions were indicated by different colours worn on the sleeves. That's the first vaccine passport set. In this paper from over a century ago, we can see the formation of all the responses we still experience during the major pandemic. The real surprise for the British scientific elites was the realization that they had made a discovery that was before unrealizable. There was a significant link between the fear of a virus and the implementation of wide-reaching social control initiatives. Whilst the British were busy bad-mouthing the Chinese and working off the information they had received from Farrar, they seemed completely unaware of their inadequacies in pandemic response. They displayed a systematic superiority complex that sabotaged the potential of coherent collaboration. Manchuria had been a steep and useful learning curve for pandemic preparedness, and every Western power would fail at the next test they'd be faced with. The story, so Farrar. Reginald Farrar had stunned the British medical establishment with his expertise, first in India and then in the Far East. He continued getting opportunities and soon found himself working for the British Red Cross, the League of Nations, and the Norton Foundation. He had given great insight into not only the spread of illness itself, but the way outbreaks can be used to enact sweeping measures which have the potential to change people's social practices, behaviors, and which rules they're willing to obey. It's become clear that the threat of significant illness gave nation-states powers which could directly affect human behavior. In 1918, a World War I medal roll index card lists Reginald Anstruther Farrar as a potential recipient of an award referred to as a 1914 Star. The document lists Farrar as achieving the rank of major and notes him as a member of the local government board. In 1922, Reginald Anstruther Farrar's death was recorded in the National Probate Calendar for England and Wales. It notes that Farrar as a resident of Hillfield Harrow on Hill in Middlesex and records Farrar's dying on the 28th of December 1921 at the German hospital in Moscow. His son, Reverend David Mapleton Farrar, is also listed as the clerk for the probate. In February 1922, Reginald Farrar's death was reported in the Sunday Dispatch of London in a short announcement titled, "Died of Typhus." It reads, "A son of Dean Farrar, Dr. Reginald Anstruther Farrar of Highfield Harrow, who died of typhus fever at German hospital in Moscow while engaged with Dr. Nanin in the organization of famine relief in Russia, left £1,997. There you go. That is Reginald Farrar, pictured in Russia before his death, chopping potatoes or bread, I'm not sure which one, and giving them out to people. Almost 100 years later, Jeremy Farrar was to become central to the global pandemic response to SARS-CoV-2. There are glaringly obvious similarities between Jeremy and Reginald Farrar's life. They both spent part of their career studying sickness in East Asia. They both became central to analyzing and incorporating official responses to the threat of deadly pandemics, and they both used previously untested new methods of inoculation on unwitting test subjects. However, what may be most surprising about the stories of Jeremy Farrar and Reginald Farrar is that although they were separated by a century of scientific discovery, both vaccinators seemed almost as clueless as each other about the actual benefits. Instead, both men were developing a branch of medicine which required a lot of human fuel to get correct. They were not afraid to push the boundaries of their science, seemingly without a care for many human lives it would cost. Reginald Farrar was as central to the same establishment at the start of the 20th century as Jeremy Farrar is today, and it leaves us with one question in particular. Are Reginald Farrar and Jeremy Farrar from the same family? To answer that question, I had to look at Jeremy Farrar's father, Eric Farrar, who was born in 1917. I became even more curious when I discovered that Eric Farrar's mother and father were meant to be 52 years old when he was born. Their previous child had been born 11 years before, and it is very unlikely that two people in their 50s would have been capable of having a child, especially in 1917. Granted, it's not impossible, but for any woman, the chances of falling pregnant past the age of 40 drop off considerably. That led me to investigate further and flung me down an unexpected rabbit hole with all roads leading to Westminster elite who surround Queen Victoria and the British royal family. But that's another story about another man who was also called Eric Farrar, or Eric, little by little. And there you go. There you go. Remember, you can get stories like this, articles like this. You can get them early by being a patron. You can support my work at the bottom of these articles. Buy me a coffee, become a patron, support me on Ko-Fi. Whatever you could do to support my work is really appreciated because I don't get paid by anyone. So constantly trying to struggle to make ends meet, especially in a world where it gets censored heavily by all sides. You know, neither side like the truth, neither side like the truth. And that, my friends, is A Tale of Two Farrars, the story of Jeremy Farrar, my search for Jeremy Farrar's ancestry that led me to this other man, Reginald Farrar, and that it is an extraordinary tale. It is an extraordinary tale. These men, separated by over 100 years, lived basically the same life. They became central to the British establishment's understanding of a pandemic as it was happening, and wrote in action and action, the standard operating procedures that would happen would be followed under pandemic as pandemic protocols. That's quite amazing. That's quite amazing. Separated by that much time. Honestly, I didn't expect it. I thought it was a mistake at first. Like I thought I didn't find necessarily. I didn't go back in time and follow Jeremy Farrar's family history and come back to Reginald Farrar. I had come to Reginald Farrar in a different way while I was investigating pandemic procedures during writing some articles for Unlimited Hangout, and then via the Welcome 5 articles. I found this paper, Plague in Manchuria, and I thought, Farrar? What would be the chances of that? And once I read it and realized how important and central he was to creating the standard operating procedures that would be put in place, the policies that would be put in place under pandemics, that was really surprising because, well, the only person I know in my lifetime who's had that sort of sway over the British establishment is really Jeremy Farrar. And for them both to share this rare same last name, Farrar, surprised me. And then I thought I'll go back in Jeremy Farrar's family history and see what I find. And what I found was this point where you get back to 1917 and there's this Jeremy Farrar's father's being born to two parents who are 52 years old. I just don't believe it. Smelt fishy. I was looking for fish and I found fish. So when you're looking for fish, you find fish, you go, is that a fish? Probably a fish. So I went fishing even more, and this is where it gets even further. I mean, this article is really important because you get to follow pandemic policy. You get to learn about the way that the establishment used the pandemic to create fear. We see it now today in this world, and we know that it was the same thing back then. They saw the potential of using that fear against people and how it could change behavior. And so this has been a major tool. Pandemics have been a major tool in manipulating people into doing what the establishment wants them to do. That is a massively important thing to discover. And so I found it very interesting. Now, I have gone further. I'm halfway through the second part of this, and I think I found who uh, Eric, who is the grandfather or the real grandfather of Jeremy Farrar. I think I found it, and it's not the people who are listed down as his family. It's someone else, and it's related to Reginald Farrar, and it's very interesting. And it's another man called Eric, which also is interesting because Farrar's father's called Eric. And you'll understand this man actually has a reason why he wouldn't be able to publicly have a child. So it would make sense that he would get pushed into another family, maybe in a further branch of the Farrar family, and they would bring him up. And well, there you go. That's it. Again, like I say, it's a journey down the rabbit hole that that article, the article I just read you, that first part has been written over about a 2 year period. As I've said before in other videos, like I'm well ahead of certain things. No one's going to find, like, no one else has decided to go and research Reginald Farrar, has come across his name. I'm amazed at that, to be honest. I thought there'd be more about it. I thought there'd be more people who would stumble across it and go, God, look how interesting this is. But it turns out nobody reads these sort of things. They go back, they see a name, they go, oh, that might be nothing, and go on. But this was a really interesting one, and I'm glad that I got to the end of it. It's taken me a while to get it out because to understand what the story is properly, I've had to do a lot more research over a long time, and I've been pretty alone on this one because it's hard. I did write part of the what's in here. I was written for like this documentary. I started writing something called the what was it called? The controller virus. Isolating death was the first part, but unfortunately, due to the fact that everything was being suppressed and censored, it became hard to write it, and then my life was all over the place. So it also became hard to write and record it. Hopefully, I'll get back to that at some point because I think it's a story worth telling. The past, I mentioned some of these people who were important to the birth of vaccine technology all came around at this time. Now, in that period during the Manchurian plague, when you had the international symposium happen in China, Dr. Wu was the one who put that on. He invented the N95 masks. Dr. Zabolotny was the Russian who came to that international symposium. He was very interested. He was the guy who gave himself TB to prove that he was vaccinated, and became important in all parts of Russian history during an important time, the Russian Revolution, all through 1917, the Bolsheviks, and all of that. So that's really interesting. Dr. Strong, who I mentioned in there, he was the American physician who was working out of Manila. He was actually sent to the symposium by the Rockefeller Institute, which is extremely interesting as well. That they were the ones who were deciding. Of course, British was Reginald Farrar. The Japanese sent Kitasato Shibasaburo, one of the most evil men in history. This guy, once 1911, when the symposium happened in 1911, soon after, at the end of the year, the symposium happened at the beginning of the year. In the second half of the year, the last emperor of China got installed on the throne. So it was a Japanese rule over a lot of China, and was a tense time until, the war. It really tense time. And so that's a really interesting story in itself. And Kitasato Shibasaburo was a hated man. He was someone who would later, he would, like, for instance, lock an entire village of Chinese people within, give them plague, and watch how they reacted, and they tore each other apart. And if anybody tried to leave, they would just shoot them. So they watched people tear each other apart to see how people acted. So it's really interesting, all of these different players who were at this time of vaccine technology spreading disease wherever they went on purpose. And of course, these guys are testing out by trying to isolate diseases and then give diseases to people to see what happens. And within 6 years from this time, you've got that sleeping disease that was so prevalent and appeared and disappeared by the 50s, within the 50s. And you also had the outbreak, the Spanish flu outbreak, which looks like it was partially done to test out. There was lots of density. There's lots of density in the trenches of people all together, really bad disease, a place for disease, a perfect place to test out a petri dish, to test out giving people disease. So that was a really interesting one too. They happened just afterwards. I think this was a time where they were testing out giving disease to people for years and years, and it worked. They gave disease to a lot of people, and a lot of people died, and a lot of new diseases were created. I think, a lot of people say like flu and stuff didn't exist before this time, and I'm starting to think they were right. I'm starting to think this is the moment when they started making us all ill. They started spreading disease on purpose to see what would happen. And in amongst these guys were all people who were Fabians and who believed in culling the masses, had the Malthusian intent within them, trained within them. So it's a very interesting story, and I'm glad you could join me. Support my work. Come to newspace.com. You'll find links on the link tree. You'll find other ways to support my work. Come, indulge. There's loads of articles there, and it's growing all of the time. And they're very long form, interesting, dive deep articles. There's lots of read throughs. You can find me on YouTube, Rumble, or Rockfin, whatever, blah blah blah. Come find me. Newspace podcast I try and release regularly. And please come. The most recent one was actually kind of related to this. Me and Josh Walcott was looking at his research about RFK's HHS nomination. and the vaccine policies as they stand currently today. Very interesting conversation. So come to the site, learn a little bit, have a discussion. Remember, if you leave notes, if you leave a comment, I'll try and respond. I'm super interactive. I'm on X a lot if you want to find me. And other than that, thank you for joining me on this Johnny Vedmore read through. Bye.
Young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina, and so on, that we penetrate the cabinets.